Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bill Schneider. I'm joined on the phone also by Dr. Ashley Seamer, our Director of Program Evaluation. Today we're going to focus on our basic skills program, and we're going to look at various things within this. So we're going to look at our state and federal funding models. We're also going to focus on our core measure, the measurable skills gain. And we're also going to touch upon some other metrics as well, including participant attendance hours, post-test rates, and status attainment. If you have any questions as we go along, please type those in the conversation box. We'll probably go through about half of this presentation, and then we'll take a break, and we'll look over those questions and answer as many as we can and kind of move forward. This session could last a little bit over an hour, so if you can stick with us through the full time, we appreciate it. Okay, so let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is the state funding model and the state and federal funding model. And also another point that I've got too is that if there's those of you out there that work at CBOs, most of this data included in here is focused on the community colleges, but I'm sure there's a lot of good information that you take with you as well. So the first slide looks at, for our community colleges, where does the funding come from? And we can see that, about 70% is really kind of enrollment based on state FTE. And also looking at our Title II funding, there's about another 10% that also comes from contact hours. So about 80% is really based on enrollment. Through our federal funding is also 3% base. And the 17%, what's left over, 10% is for state performance funding, and the other is for MSG through federal funding as well. So about 17% of the funding, it comes from really looking at performance-based. Okay. Now, when I mentioned weighted contact hours, so this is really kind of tied to the federal funding piece. So 50% of all Title II federal funding goes towards weighted contact hours. And the way these are measured is they're based on 3 different tiers. So there's Tier A, Tier B, and Tier C. And you can kind of see the weights are 5, 4, and 3. The weights that are 5 are associated with really your lowest levels of your students. So we're looking at really your AB low and also your basic ESL low as well. Now, on the opposite end, the EFLs with the lowest weight are those that are associated with secondary adult education. And everything else gets a weight of 4 associated with tiers. So these all get tier points based on each contact hour and which tier they fall into. Okay. There's also base funding. So of the federal Title II 231 funding, 15% goes to base. So across all providers, including our CBO partners, every single provider receives the same amount of funding, and that is 15% of the total base. Okay, going back to the performance funding, this is all based on measurable skills gain. This is 35% of the Title II 231 funding from the federal government. And in addition, there's also $6 million that comes from state funding to fund the MSG measure. Now, the measure is consistent, so the methodology associated with the MSG is not different between the state and federal measures. However, the levels of success do differ for state and federal measures. So we have different benchmarks depending on if we're assessing for state purposes versus federal purposes. And for those that are familiar with our state performance funding model, we also leverage a similar model for the federal government as well, as far as looking at quality, which is looking at really your success rate within each measure, and then we're also looking at impact. So that's associated with the actual number of successes within the measure. So I mentioned before there's different levels of success. And for the state benchmarks, they're based on looking at, they're really statistically derived. So they're looking at standard deviations. So we set, based on our historical data for this measure, we have one historical year that we leverage to drive these. So moving forward, our excellence level for this measure is going to be 50.6%, which is one standard deviation above the historical mean. And we have a baseline at 24.2%, which is 2 standard deviations below the historical mean. On the federal side, we measure a little differently. So we have negotiated state targets with the federal government, and for this upcoming year, it's 39%. So our targets are based on 110% of that state target. So for federal government target, it's going to be 42.9%. And on the opposite end, our baseline is 80% of the state target, which is 31.2%. Okay, now shifting over to who we serve and how many we serve, North Carolina ranks 5th in the country and looking at as far as the number of participants, and these are those that have at least 12 attendance hours during the year. And we can see those top 5 make over 50% of all the participants in basic skills across the country. So we look here, once again, it's just kind of I cut off California and Florida here, just kind of so you can better see where North Carolina stacks against other states. So this is the actual number of participants we have for the 16-17 year. However, when we look at this is the actual number who made a measurable skill gain. So looking at the number of participants, we're pretty high, but when we actually look at those who actually made a gain, we don't look as impressive. So looking at the actual success rate for 16-17, as we're at 35%, which is about, I think, about the 8th lowest in the country. And Ashley, you want to talk about the actual methodology associated with this measure?
Sure. So measurable skills gains are the primary indicator of student outcomes that we use for our basic skills students. To put this into context, the students that are served in your program who get at least 12 hours of service are determined to be in a period of participation. Any student that achieves that 12-hour milestone without a break in service has a period of participation and then is eligible for being evaluated for measurable skills gains. If a student has a separation in service of more than 90 days and returns the same program year and achieves 12 additional hours of service, that is considered a new period of participation. So there are some students in our programs that have multiple POPs in the course of a program year. Most of our students have 1, some of our students have 2, and less than a handful of students have 3. That's been our trend over the last 2 years of evaluating gains according to periods of participation. Going to go to the next slide. So with periods of participation, there are 5 different ways of achieving gains. The first type of gain that a student can achieve is through pre- and post-testing. This is how most of our students achieve their gains. So when a student enters a program year or into a new period of participation, they are given a post-test, or a post-test is carried forward from a previous period of participation, and that test is used to evaluate how much a student is learning during their time of receiving service with the program. And when a student achieves a high enough score on a post-test, that student would achieve a pre- and post-test gain. The second type of gain a student can achieve is adult high school credit. This is for students in our adult high school program who enter with less than 75% of the required credits and then cross that 75% threshold during the program year. The next type of gain is the secondary school diploma or its equivalent. So this could be either a post-secondary, a high school equivalency test gain, meaning that they pass the GED, HiSET, or TASC test, or an AHS graduate. So either of those would count as a secondary school diploma or its equivalent. And then the final type of gain that we have is a post-secondary enrollment gain, and this occurs when a student has achieved that 12 hours, exits our program, and then enrolls in post-secondary education, whether that's with us or with any other institution of higher education. We look for enrollment in post-secondary education before the end of the program year. So if that occurs, that student earns a post-secondary enrollment gain. The gains are awarded based on the last gain that is achieved for that student, and a student can only get one credit for one type of gain per POP. So a student may have a pre and post test gain and exit the program and get post-secondary enrollment, a post-secondary enrollment gain, but for that POP, which is our denominator, the student would only be credited for one gain during that period.
Thank you, Ashley. So if we shift gears and look at something a little different, so we focused previously on measurable skills gain. Next thing we'll look at is actually participant attendance hours. So I mentioned before is looking at the actual number of participants, we are 5th in the country, but looking at the actual participant attendance hours, we are at 4th in the country. And looking at per participant, once again, we're pretty high. We're at 133, and that also is 5th in the country, so we're 133 compared, we see nationally that most states are actually below 100 when it comes to the average attendance hours per participant. So what's interesting about this is the actual blue bars represent the actual hours. The red dots represent the actual measurable skill gains. So despite having one of the higher number of attendance hours per participants in the country, we also have one of the lower success rates. So we also looked at the correlation coefficient for this. So across the country, we found there's actually a negative correlation between the actually average attendance hours for participants versus the actual measurable skills gains success rate. And this is just another way of looking at the data, which actually is looking at sorted not by the actual hours, but the actual MSGs across the country. Okay, so another way of looking at the data is looking at really these different, building these boxes as far as a green versus red box. So what we would hope is that students are making measurable skills gains in less hours, so they're progressing in a more timely manner. So those states that you see in the top left-hand side, the ones in the green box, they represent ones that actually are exceeding the national average as far as MSG, but also they're doing it less hours as far as average hours than the rest of the country. So then we have the bottom right-hand box, which is the red box, which actually shows those are actually taking more than the average hours per participant, but have a lower MSG than the actual national average. And that darker big dot you see there, that represents North Carolina. So North Carolina, we're pretty much down towards that bottom right-hand quartile as far as looking at the actual where we actually have a very high number of average hours and a very low MSG success rate. So looking at a different area, looking at participant post-test rates, we can see here that while we're not as low as we are for the MSGs, we're, I think, about 10th lowest in the country as far as the actual participant post-test rate. Now, unlike what we saw with the looking at the actual hours compared to MSGs, we find that there is some correlation between the actual participant post-test rate and the measurable skills gains. So looking at correlation coefficient for this measure, we're looking at about 0.64, which is a pretty high correlation between the actual state's post-test rate versus their actual measurable skills gains. So the states that actually test more frequently tend to see higher measurable skills gains. And once again, this is just sorted a little differently, and this is sorted by the measurable skills gains. So one of the things we hear, once in a while is, when we compare nationally, we hear that North Carolina is different than, we serve different students, and that kind of drives why we may have higher, hours and lower success rates. So I think, some of that is correct. So looking at the actual distribution of our participants, we see that our percentage of AB level 1s are actually, we have 5% of our total participants fall in that level compared to 2% nationally. So it's about 3% higher for us than the rest of the country. On the opposite end, the rest of the country tends to serve more ESL level 1s. So we are 4% lower there. The rest of the actual percentages, there's usually only about 2, except for looking at AB level 5, there's also, we serve a higher proportion of our students fall into AB level 5 compared to the rest of the country. So for the most part, things are similar outside those 3 areas that we talked about. When we look at measurable skills gains, overall we're about 9% lower than the rest of the country. If we break it down by the actual EFL levels, our greatest difference is the AB level 1. So nationally, that success rate's at 49%, but we're only at 23% in North Carolina. So the national average is about twice as high as North Carolina. And you can see the rest of the AB levels, it's ranges anywhere from about 6 to 12%. We also have a pretty low percent when we look at AB level 6. Look at the ESL students, they're fairly consistent, and on average they are 8% below the national level. So nationally, we're at 43% for the ESL students and 34% for North Carolina. Despite what we're seeing as far as looking at the success rates for measurable skills gains, we mentioned before is the average attendance hours are much higher in North Carolina. So we're 47% higher in North Carolina than the national total of 90. So 133 compared to 90. Now, if we look at our ABE students, it's actually 61% higher. And where the concentration of those hours fall in AB level 1. So it's about 3 times as much average hours in AB level 1 in North Carolina than we see in the country. So about 359 compared to 105. And it's also a lot higher, too, for AB level 2. So once again, despite these hours, we're not seeing the gains and successes. Now, looking at the ESL population, it's fairly consistent across the board for levels 1 through 6, but 23% higher in North Carolina compared nationally. Now, if we look at post-test rates, we do a good job as far as compared nationally with AB level 1 as far as testing goes. So it's 4% higher in North Carolina compared nationally. And this could very well be because that these students are we're serving them longer hours, so there's greater chance for them to get post-tests. But we're 4% above the national totals there. The rest of the groups looking at AB levels 2 through 5, it's probably on average about 5% below what we see nationally. And then for the ESL population across the board, it totals about 11% below the national, where we're at 55% compared nationally at 66%. All right, so we breezed through those, and now we're at halftime. Ashley, are there any questions that you see popping up in conversation that we want to talk before we move forward?
I'm not seeing any so far. If you all have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. We're monitoring that, and we'll definitely respond to those questions as they come in. So we did get one question. Is any of this information broken down by service area? So not in this presentation, and we would need to understand a little bit more by what's meant by service area. If you can put that into the chat box, we can respond to that. By each college. Thank you for clarifying. We do have the information broken down by college in the data, but for this presentation, we are staying at the state level. Okay, Rebecca says, do other states have different assessment manuals than North Carolina? Rebecca, the answer to that is yes. Each state develops their own assessment policies, and that dictates what assessments can be offered in the state and what their testing practices are in the state. So the answer to that question is yes. And Jen says, does NC serve more students in comp ed in comparison to other states? Bill, I'm not sure if you have the answer to that. I would say we definitely have heard feedback about ABE Level 1 and the number of students that we serve in comp ed that may be contributing to some of the data points that have been presented. I don't know about comparison of overall percentages because that is not something I'm aware of peer analysis for. Bill, I think this one is for you. Can you provide an example of how the weighted contact hours translate to funding?
Sure. So when we're looking at, I believe the weighted contact hours were 50% of federal funds. So if we think about that as a pot of money, and every contact hour as being a potential point for weighting. So when we take so every single contact hour you have, let's say the lower levels would count as 5 points. The highest levels would count as 3 points. Everything in between would count as 4 points. So if you multiply your hours out by those various buckets, you would have like your total points that you have for your institution. So what we do then is, depending on your proportion of points, so if you represent, let's say, 5% of all the actual hour points across the system, you would get 5% of the 50% of the federal funding. So really 50 times 5, so you'd actually get about 2.5% of the federal monies based on contact hours. Okay, not seeing any more questions, we'll move forward, and we'll go back to the conversation box at the end of the presentation. And so feel free to keep on typing your questions in the conversation. We'll go back later. All right, so previously going back to measurable skills gains. So we focus on looking at the 16-17 data. So that's what we have comparisons looking at nationally. So we see there's our 35% compared to the 45% nationally. So as you see these green dots, that represent the 16-17 national totals. And anytime you see a blue bar represents the North Carolina 16-17. We're also going to be looking at some red bars here that represent 17-18. So the good news is statewide, our measurable skills gains has improved. So we're up from 35% up to 40%. And if we look at the AB levels, here's where we were last year. And this year's, for the most part, they've also increased. So for AB level 1, we've gone from 23 to 29%. We also seen pretty big gains in AB level 6 from 32 to 39%. The only area which we did not see any improvements was AB level 5, which stayed flat at 43%. Now shifting over to the ESL, we're seeing pretty much similar trends as far as increases across the ESL levels too. So I think our biggest one was looking at the actual ESL level 6, where we went from 22 to 28%, and everywhere else is approximately about a 3 or 4% increase across the other ESL levels. So this is kind of combining all the different areas. You kind of see once again the differences and improvements that we made, you know, comparing 16-17 to 17-18. Now for average attendance hours, we mentioned before where we're at 90, or 90 was the national average last year, and we're at 133. Really nothing changed a whole lot. So we're increased actually to 134 this year. And if we're looking at actual AB levels, we've actually increased in AB level 1. So we actually went from 359 to 398. And we've had marginal to flat increases across the other AB levels. On the ESL side, we can see they've been fairly flat. So not a huge change in hours on the ESL side from last year to this year. Okay. This is a different way of looking at it. This is actually looking at, of those individuals who actually had a measurable skill gain or did not have measurable skill gain, what was the average hours of attendance for those individuals. So statewide, for the 17-18 year, for those individuals who did not make a measurable skill gain, their average attendance hours were 105. So all of the students who did not make a gain, the average hours 105. Compared to those who made a gain, the average hours is 186. Now we look at AB level 1 and 2, and we combine these. AB level 1 and 2, for those that did not make a gain, they spent 248 hours, and for those with a measurable skill gains, it was about 316. And for AB levels 3 and 4, and also for ABs 5 and 6 and ESL, you can see here that's also pretty big gaps as far as looking at those that had no measurable skill gain versus those who actually made a gain. All right, so everyone hopefully remembers this slide here that kind of showcases North Carolina. Looking at the different quartiles as far as success versus hours. Now, if we do a similar analysis, looking at the colleges in North Carolina, this is how we fall. So we only had one college that actually had a measurable skill gain rate that was higher than the national average and had average hours below the national average. And we see that we have a lot, actually majority of our schools actually fell in kind of that red box, which meant that we're below the national average but had more than the average hours attendance. Now, if we're a little nicer with this box, we'd expand it and look at, okay, what about North Carolina? So now where you see the box shift, this looks at where we're at within our state as far as the averages go. So we do expand about a lot more schools are actually, above average as far as MSG and below average on average hours. But we do see there's pockets, there's about, I think about 8 schools here that actually fall in this dark red area, which means that they have lower than the state average in MSG, but have more average hours than what we had for the rest of North Carolina. Okay. Now, what about the post-test rate? Did we see any changes this year in post-test rate? So we remember before we're at 54% compared to 62% nationally. We did see pretty big strides in this. So it's increased from 54 to 57% for post-test rates for the 17-18 year. Now look at the various levels, look at the AB levels 1 through 5. Big increases in AB level 1. So it went from 63 to 76%. And some of the other areas were fairly flat, but we did also saw some increase, especially in AB level 2, went from 57 to 61%. On the ESL side, we saw increases, and they're fairly consistent across the board. So looking at probably 3-4% across most of these different ESL levels. Okay. Now, this one here is actually looking at, here is the actual participant post-test rate compared to measurable skills gains. And this is across the institute. So once again, kind of showcasing there seems to be some correlation between, even within our institutions in North Carolina, the post-test rate compared to measurable skill gains. And that correlation, once again, is pretty strong at a 0.71. All right, so there's one more measure that we want to look at. That is the participant status attainment. We don't have any national comparisons with this, but we can see that last year we're at 83%. So this is of all of the individuals that you serve, what percent reached the 12-hour attendance? And went from 83 to 84% this year. And breaking out by the various AB levels, we can see the biggest increase came in AB level 1. Most of the other areas were flat. On the ESL side, once again, some slight changes. We had a slight drop in ESL 1, but we saw a pretty big jump from 82 to 86% for ESL 3. All right, so I'm going to give you guys about 2 minutes this is a link to really 5 tables that are associated with all the data we just showcased, and it'll actually have your institutional results. So this is once again just for the community colleges, and you might want to click on this link soon because we will take this link down after the presentation's over. And if you're having issues as far as clicking the link should be active and live, but if you're unable to, you might want to try to type it in. And what we'll do is we'll actually go ahead and copy and paste that. At least I was hoping to. So somebody actually copy and paste that into the conversation box for me, for those people that are having a problem with the link. Thank you, Ann. Thank you, Jonathan.
And I see your question there, Terry. We'll go ahead and take that. Terry asks, are there any noticeable factors about programs in the green that are different from the red other than the table measurements? So I'm not sure what exactly we're referring to about when you say table measurements, but some of the things that we look at specifically when we evaluate programs and how well they're hitting that MSG target is first is retention. Are you keeping students long enough to have them receive the amount of service that they need to get a gain? So once they hit that 12-hour threshold, it does not benefit the program or the student to leave shortly after hitting that 12-hour threshold because they haven't stayed around long enough to benefit from the program to take a post-test per the manufacturer's guidelines or to complete an AHS program. You know, they haven't been there long enough. So the first thing we look at is, are you keeping your students long enough for them to provide a gain? And the other big thing that we look at is your post-test rate. Are you post-testing students and post-testing them at, you know, the best time so that they can achieve those gains through pre and post-testing? Bill, you may have other major things you want to speak to, or Rena, I know you're on the phone. You can also speak and chime in here about distinguishing factors for programs that are achieving high outcomes versus those who may not be.
So I've unmuted Rena. Rena, I'm not sure if you had anything to add. If not, that's fine.
Okay, Rena says her mic's not working. You can certainly feel free to chime in the text box, or if there are providers out there where you've done something different or new with your program and you've seen the real benefit to your students in terms of the gains that they're able to achieve, certainly feel free to share that as well.
Okay. So we're going to go ahead and transition away from the slide. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to kind of show each of the reports, and I'll kind of walk through reports, make sure everybody understands what the color coding is and what the different columns are. So the table 1, is really your measurable skill gains. So it's looking at, of your period's participation, what percent of those POPs make you measurable skill gains. And the first column where you kind of see POP, that's just your period's participation. Where you see total and MSG for 17-18, that's your 17-18 measurable skill gain percentage. So of those POPs, what percent made a gain? So the color coding for this is actually based on the national totals. So for this, we're comparing against nationally. So the green means better, the red means worse. Yellow right in the middle means you're pretty much at the national average. The more red you are means the closer you are to really the bottom 10 percentile, and then if you're in a dark green, it means you're in top 10 percentile for the system. Okay. Now shifting to the right, looking at the various levels. Okay, very similar to what we did as far as looking at the total POPs. And with the color coding, there is pretty much a similar, except it's a little less on the colors as far as they're more pastel, but they're pretty much mean the same thing. So the reds mean you're more towards really the bottom 10 percentile. The green means you're more towards the top 10 percentile. But really kind of what we're comparing ourselves here is against the national average. And that goes across to ABE and as well as the ESL. Okay, table 2. This is looking at average attendance hours. And for this one, I did not necessarily use the green color to indicate as a success. It's more we're looking at from a white means you're low on participation hours, with red meaning you have more of a concentration of participation hours. So for most institutions, we see anything that's white means they're actually below the national average. But as you see yellow, you're slightly above the national average, and then as you get into red, you're in the bottom 10 percentile. And just like with the previous table, it's pretty much consistent the same way across the other subgroups as well. Table 3. We talked before about the participants with MSG versus no MSG. So this provides you with institutional totals as far as looking at, for all your participants who had no MSG, how many hours of participation did they have, versus those with no MSG, what were the percent with no, or how many hours were associated with participation. And very similarly, they're broken out also by the various subgroups as far as combining AB level 1 and 2, combining 3 and 4, 5 and 6, and also having ESL's own subgroup. All right, table 4 is looking at the post-test rate. Once again, we're comparing ourselves against the national totals. So if you're green, it means you're above the national totals. If you're in yellow, you're probably around there. But if you're kind of in the red area, it means you're probably more in the bottom 10 percentile for the state. And that is also broken out by the various EFLs. And also, I do want to point out too, is anytime you see a star, just means it's a low cell count. So anything that's less than 5, we had not reported out the percentage. And I guess I'll point out also, for those that aren't in basic skills, we exclude AB level 6 because they cannot make an EFL gain through post-test. All right, so the last table focuses on retention. So these are students that actually reach the actual participant status. So of those that are served by basic skills, the actual percentage that reach 12 hours of attendance. And this one here is actually just comparing really within the state, since we don't have any national totals. So anything that's darker red means you're closer to the bottom 10 percentile as far as post-test or participant status attainment. Dark green representing that you're towards the top 10 percentile for the state. And yellows kind of fall in between. So the question, I'm going to answer a question for Linda. So she asked which of these tables corresponds to the quartile. So you'll actually have to merge the results. So if you go back to tables 1 and 2, you'll have to take your total MSG. So we'll go back. Table 1. So I guess we'll pick on Central Carolina since Linda asked the question. So Linda can see that the MSG, I can't really tell from this one, it looks like probably like 46%. And ours are 202 average. So if you go ahead and go back to that table where we actually had the quadrants, you can kind of probably find where that point is on the quadrant. Okay, so I think I lied to you guys. I said that we would be lucky to get this done in an hour, but that is our last slide, and we're happy to answer any more questions you might have in the conversation box. So I see there's a question here from the breakout table for post-secondary enrollment that you could share. So we don't actually have it accessible, but we do have the data that's associated with that. Ashley, do you remember what our totals were, just so they know what measurable skill gains are accomplished through post-secondary enrollment?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but when we release the official data for 17 and 18, we can also provide a table that, like we did last year with the MSG report, that says what type of gain was awarded for each of the measurable skills gains. So you can get a sense of how many were awarded based on pre and post test, how many were awarded on post-secondary enrollment. When you say breakout table, are you interested in post-secondary enrollment generally, or do you want that further broken down by Con Ed enrollment and curriculum enrollment? If you want to just type that in the chat box, we'll take that feedback, and when we release the report, we can also share that data. Thank you, Anne.
And Rena mentioned earlier, I think this really kind of comes, within the data as far as looking at the post-test rate. So that's where we see most of the measurable skills gains is through EFL gains. And of course, those are highly correlated with actually the percent who are getting post-tested.
So there is a question, can a student who enrolled in the AHS program and then later earns an HSE diploma earn an MSG? So the way MSGs are reported are based on the latest MSG earned. So the answer to that would be yes. They can earn an MSG based on that subsequent high school equivalency diploma. So Linda asked if these slides, I assume, or specifically the quartile charts with the dots can be shared via CC Pro. I think we did that with our last performance partnership webinar. Are we planning to do that with this one as well?
Yeah, so we'll share the link to this recording, and we also can share the actual PowerPoint as well.
And the okay, so were we asking? Yeah. So I'm seeing the conversation between Tracy and Rena. She says, for clarification, what was the MSG rate for 17-18? Are you asking what we achieved or what our state target was? For 17-18, the target was 38%, and I believe our final rate was 39%. So we exceeded our target for this year, and for 18-19, our target is 39%. And to clarify, our rate was actually 39.9% for the state for 17-18.
That if you are on the phone and you want to ask a question, you can unmute yourself by pressing *6.
Yes, this is Tracy Buffalo. So as a state rate, then we successfully made our target rate?
That is correct. This past year, we exceeded our target rate as a state.
Thank you so much.
So, Bill, there's a question about the tension that exists between average hours that it's taking students to earn MSGs and us presenting that as something that providers should be attending to, and the at the same time the funding that's associated with FTE. I think this is a recognized tension in the programs. Do you want to speak more to that, Bill?
So yeah, I think it's a challenge that we see really not just in basic skills, but we see it across the curriculum too. So trying to find ways to make things more efficient for the student as far as trying to get them to progress in really kind of shorter periods of time. So I think ideally, I know there's challenges, but ideally, we'd want these students to make measurable skills gains and not be spending 200 hours in the classroom. So I mean, we don't really necessarily control the policy associated with that, but from a data perspective and looking at the correlations compared to other states, there does not seem to be a relationship between actually hours for an institution versus the actual success rates.
And Rena is diving a little further into some data limitations that we have at the system office that we're going to try to further dive into this year, which is being able to precisely pinpoint when students earn an MSG, because there are students who earn MSGs in our programs who stay on and continue to accumulate hours. Even within a POP, you can earn an MSG and still continue to receive service, and those hours are still going to be accumulated during that POP. So we need to do a little bit of a deeper dive, hopefully with some new details that we're getting in our data files. We will be able to do that deeper dive and precisely pinpoint when a student, at what point in their total hours accumulation, they are achieving those MSGs. I think the slides presented today just focused at a macro level on total hours, and the fact that our total hours are high compared to other states, but our total MSGs are relatively low compared to other states, not necessarily looking at that within a specific student's record, but just generally at those macro trends.
And I think I saw a question about the actual FT miles across other states. Really that varies across states. Even across states, whoever really kind of the oversight for basic skills programs varies. Some, fall within community colleges. A lot fall within their Department of Public Instruction. So that varies, and the miles for funding differ as well. And I think there also was another question too, which I think Ashley touched upon as far as the additional analysis associated with this. So this is just kind of like a preview for more data to come. Last year we released our measurable skills gain report in December. We're hoping this year to get released sometime this month. So you'll be able to drill down really into more data, especially by different functional levels within the MSG report. Ashley, you seen anything else?
I don't. Randolph just asked, which table corresponds to the performance measure dot, or has this changed? So do you want to talk about the, let's see, I would say that the performance measures for 17-18 are going to be on that table 1 in that first column, the number of POPs, and then the MSGs. So that is going to be in that first column. And Bill, remind me, the coloring on this table, is that that is not performance measure funding coloring, right?
No, that is not.
So do you want to talk, do you want to just clarify that again for everyone?
Yeah, so if they're interested, and I'll go back, because I can't remember the exact benchmarks, but I'll find it in the presentation. It was early on as far as looking at the distributions and looking at what different color codes were. Okay, so for this year, if you have a success rate that is below 24.2%, that means you're below the baseline. If you have a success rate that is above 50.6%, you've exceeded the excellence level. If you are between 41.8 and 50.6%, you'll get a yellow dot. And if you're between 24.2% and 41.8%, you'll get a red dot.
And those baselines for 17-18 baseline and excellence levels were based on the 17-18 data. So your performance funding and your baseline and excellence level for this first measure for performance funding are exactly the same. They're based on 1 year of data.
So I see there's a question here from Brunswick about the concern of focusing on hours. I think we do expect that if we look at the lowest EFL, that those are probably disproportionately individuals with learning disabilities. But we also see similar trends across other areas as well. So it's not just at level 1. But we do need to also keep in account too that according to the federal government, we are supposed to be assessing all students the same, regardless of really their learning capabilities. So, we're trying to stay consistent with that. And in addition to that, I mean, there is, we do fund, as a state based on hours. So it's important that we're making sure these students are making gains no matter what their level of, function level is.
Is the post-testing rate still going to be at 68%?
I will let Rena. Rena, can you type in the answer to that question? So as we're waiting for Rena on that one, we do not know what % of our students receive accommodations because we do not collect that data centrally.
Thank you.
So there's another question as far as show the slides that compare the hours with MSGs versus without MSGs. So we'll make our way towards there. Okay, so here's a slide. So you want to see the slides that compare the hours with MSG versus without MSG. Thank you, Rena. For those on the phone, Rena, respond as far as the goal is still to post-test at least 65% of students, and they meet the test manufacturer's guideline for post-testing. So someone else wants to see the scattergram again. And as a reminder, the lines and the boxes associated with the scattergram, the dark green you see on top left-hand side represents the national numbers as far as the number of colleges that exceed the national MSG levels but have lower than the actual average of hours of attendance. And the box, the red box to the right, the pinkish box that goes next that corresponds to that, that's a national average that shows the really those as far as below the MSG level nationally, but exceed the average hours. And the green boxes and red boxes that shift to the right and shift downward, that corresponds with state totals within North Carolina. So Karen,
go ahead.
No,
I was just going to respond to Rebecca. The manufacturer's guidelines are, I believe, consistent that states should be following the manufacturer's guidelines related to the number of hours prior to post-testing. As far as the 65% target, I think that is our state's policy, and I'm not aware of what other states use as their target.
So still trying to get through some of these questions. It looks like there was a question from Hyro about correlation and how we compare against states that serve the same number of this population. So we could do that. So we could take those states that serve bigger populations and do similar comparisons. And we'll see that there are some lower performing states that don't do as well as us. Like Florida has high hours and low MSGs, but I think there's also some other big states like Washington. I think even like Illinois, that actually kind of we see the opposite. right, so I hope that we've answered most of y'all's questions. We're at 4:30, so I think we are going to go ahead and wrap things up, but we greatly appreciate you joining us. We're going to make sure that the link to this goes on our Performance Partnership website, and we'll also try to make sure we get the presentation out to you guys. And I appreciate you spending time with us.